There was a time when a child's body was expected to be resilient, not invincible, but capable, strong enough to climb, run, fall, and recover without much thought. Childhood illness existed, of course, measles, mumps, chickenpox, but chronic conditions were rare enough to be memorable. The child with the inhaler was notable. The one with severe allergies stood out. Diabetes in children was so uncommon that when it appeared, it carried a specific name: juvenile diabetes, a term that suggested rarity, exception. By the early 2000s, something had shifted. The exceptions had become common. 1 in 13 children now carried an EpiPen. 1 in 6 had a developmental disorder. Obesity, once considered an adult condition, was being diagnosed in toddlers. Type 2 diabetes, a disease historically tied to aging and lifestyle, began appearing in children as young as 8. Asthma rates had tripled since the 1980s. Autoimmune conditions, lupus, Crohn's disease, juvenile arthritis, were rising in pediatric populations at rates epidemiologists struggled to explain. This was not a sudden epidemic. It was gradual, incremental, so slow that each generation of parents simply adjusted to the new baseline. Baby food changed, school lunches changed, snack aisles expanded. Juice boxes replaced water. Breakfast became an aisle of brightly colored cereals engineered for shelf stability and appeal. And quietly, without much fanfare, childhood itself was recalibrated around a new kind of body, one that required more intervention, more medication, more management. The child's body had not evolved, but everything it consumed had. In 1977, the United States government issued new dietary guidelines. Fat was the enemy. Cholesterol was dangerous. The American Heart Association, along with federal health agencies, encouraged families to reduce saturated fat and replace it with carbohydrates, especially grains. Whole milk was swapped for skim. Butter was replaced with margarine. Eggs, once a breakfast staple, were limited. Red meat was reduced. In their place came low-fat yogurt sweetened with corn syrup, fat-free cookies, processed cereals fortified with vitamins to replace what had been stripped during manufacturing. The food industry responded with enthusiasm. If that was the problem, then removing it was the solution. But fat carries flavor. Without it, food tastes flat, unappealing. So sugar was added, not just to desserts, but to bread, pasta sauce, salad dressing, crackers, and anything marketed as low-fat or heart-healthy. The average American child in 1970 consumed roughly 10 pounds of sugar per year. By 2000, that number had risen to over 60 pounds. Corn syrup became ubiquitous, cheaper than cane sugar and easier to blend into processed foods. High-fructose corn syrup appeared in nearly everything designed for convenience. It was in ketchup, in granola bars, in yogurt cups marketed to parents as a healthy snack. Even infant formula contained corn syrup solids, introduced in the 1960s to reduce cost and extend shelf life. Baby food, once made from simple purees of vegetables and meat, became standardized and sweetened. Carrots were blended with apple juice. Peas were mixed with pears. The first taste a child experienced was often sweet, training the palate to expect that flavor in everything. Snack foods aimed at toddlers, puffs, crackers, fruit pouches, were engineered for dissolve speed and flavor intensity, but not for nutrition. They were calorically dense, but nutritionally sparse. The child's body received energy, but not the building blocks it needed. Simultaneously, traditional foods began to disappear from childhood diets. Organ meats, once common, were discarded. Bone broth, a staple in many immigrant and rural households, was replaced with canned soup or bouillon cubes. Fermented foods, pickles, sauerkraut, yogurt without added sugar became niche, ethnic, or forgotten. Cod liver oil, routinely given to children in the early 20th century for its vitamins A and D, was phased out, dismissed as old-fashioned. The very structure of eating changed. Meals became smaller, snacking became constant. The 3-meal-a-day model, which had roughly synchronized with human metabolism, was replaced by grazing, a pattern encouraged by marketing, convenience, and new ideas about preventing hunger. Children were fed every 2 hours. Blood sugar spiked, then crashed, then spiked again. Hunger cues, once tied to genuine need, became confused. And then there was the milk. Whole milk, consumed by generations of children, was replaced in the 1980s and 90s with low-fat and skim varieties, often sweetened with chocolate or strawberry syrup to make them palatable. At the same time, milk consumption overall began to decline, replaced by juice boxes and sports drinks. Vitamin D, naturally present in full-fat dairy and synthesized by sunlight on skin, began to drop in children's bodies, just as more time was being spent indoors. What replaced traditional eating was not inherently malicious. It was convenient, cheap, shelf-stable, designed to appeal to children and busy parents. It solved real problems: time, cost, accessibility. But it also represented a wholesale transformation of what a child's body was expected to run on. And the body, which had evolved over millennia to extract nutrients from whole foods, began to struggle. The first signs appeared in the 1980s. Pediatricians began noting an uptick in childhood asthma, particularly in urban areas. Food allergies, once rare, started appearing more frequently. Peanuts, eggs, milk, shellfish. Parents were told this was likely genetic or perhaps environmental. Better diagnostic tools meant conditions were being caught that had previously been missed. This explanation was repeated so often it became accepted. But the numbers kept rising. By the 1990s, peanut allergies alone had doubled, then doubled again. Schools began implementing peanut-free zones. EpiPens, once obscure, became standard in classrooms. Allergists couldn't fully explain why. Some pointed to the hygiene hypothesis. Children were too clean, their immune systems under-challenged. Others noted that peanut exposure had changed. In the 1990s, parents were advised to delay introducing peanuts to infants, the opposite of current guidance. But timing alone didn't account for the speed of the increase. What was less discussed, the state of children's gut health. The microbiome, the trillions of bacteria living in the digestive tract, was only beginning to be understood in the 1990s. Researchers would later discover that this internal ecosystem played a crucial role in immune regulation, mood, inflammation, and even brain development. And it was shaped, primarily, by what a child ate in the first years of life. Traditional diets, rich in fiber, fermented foods, and diverse fats, supported microbial diversity. Processed diets did not. High sugar intake fed specific bacterial strains while starving others. Emulsifiers and preservatives, common in packaged foods, were found to disrupt the gut lining. Antibiotics, prescribed liberally throughout the 80s and 90s for ear infections and sore throats, wiped out beneficial bacteria along with harmful ones. Formula-fed infants who missed the microbiome transfer that occurs during breastfeeding started life with a different bacterial foundation. The gut, it turned out, was not just a digestive organ. It was the command center for immune responses. And in millions of children, that center was being reprogrammed. Then came the weight. In 1980, roughly 5% of American children were considered obese. By 2000, it was 15%. By 2020, nearly 20%. The shift was so dramatic that growth charts had to be recalibrated. What had once been the outer edge of normal was now average. Doctors pointed to portion sizes, soda consumption, and lack of exercise. All true, but something deeper was at play. The children gaining weight were not necessarily eating more food. They were eating different food. Calorie-dense, but nutrient-poor. High in refined carbohydrates that spiked insulin and promoted fat storage. Low in protein and fat, which signaled satiety. Metabolic syndrome, a cluster of conditions including high blood pressure, insulin resistance, and abnormal cholesterol, began appearing in adolescence. Fatty liver disease, once seen almost exclusively in alcoholics, was being diagnosed in children who had never touched alcohol. Their livers were processing fructose, from juice, soda, sweetened snacks, in the same way an adult liver processes ethanol. The damage was silent, progressive, often not caught until adulthood. Type 2 diabetes followed. In the 1990s, it was so rare in children that some medical textbooks didn't include it in pediatric sections. By the 2010s, it accounted for nearly half of all new diabetes cases in adolescence. The children developing it were not uniformly inactive or overfed in the traditional sense. Many were consuming what had been marketed to their parents as normal, appropriate food. Breakfast cereals, granola bars, juice, low-fat snacks. Their bodies were simply unable to manage the constant glucose load. Insulin receptors, overstimulated for years, began to resist. The pancreas worked harder, then faltered. And once that process began, it was difficult to reverse. There were other changes, quieter but no less significant. Cavities, once expected in childhood, became epidemic despite widespread fluoride use. Dentists noted that even toddlers were arriving with severe decay, particularly in communities where juice and sweetened milk were given in bottles throughout the day. Teeth, like bones, require certain nutrients, calcium, vitamin D, vitamin K2, to remineralize. But many children were consuming foods that actively leached minerals rather than providing them. Bone density, too, was declining. Stress fractures in young athletes became more common. Pediatricians began seeing rickets, a disease thought eradicated in developed nations, re-emerging in children who spent little time outdoors and consumed minimal vitamin D. The fortification of milk was supposed to prevent this, but many children were no longer drinking milk. And when they did, it was often skim, which lacked the fat needed to absorb fat-soluble vitamins. Behavioral and cognitive shifts appeared as well. ADHD diagnoses began to climb in the 1990s, eventually affecting nearly 10% of children. Autism rates rose from roughly 1 in 5,000 in the 1970s to 1 in 36 by 2020. The causes were debated: better diagnoses, broader criteria, environmental toxins, genetic factors. But researchers also began examining the role of nutrition in neurodevelopment. The brain is nearly 60% fat. It requires omega-3 fatty acids, particularly DHA, for structure and function. Historically, children obtained these from fish, eggs, and dairy. But by the 1990s, many were consuming oils high in omega-6 fatty acids, corn, soybean, canola, which dominated processed foods. The ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 in the average diet had shifted from roughly 4:1 to over 20:1. Inflammation increased. Cognitive function in some studies appeared to suffer. Deficiencies in other nutrients, iron, zinc, B vitamins, also became more common, even as children consumed more calories. Their diets were energy-rich but micronutrient-poor. The body had fuel, but not the cofactors needed to use it efficiently. There was no single turning point, no moment when parents were told explicitly that the foods being marketed to their children might be inadequate or harmful. Instead, there was a gradual substitution. Real food was replaced with food products. Complexity was replaced with convenience. Nutrition was replaced with fortification, the idea that lost vitamins could simply be added back in, that a chemically enriched cereal was equivalent to a bowl of oats with berries and cream. Parents trusted what was on the shelves. They trusted the guidelines. They trusted that if something was widely available, brightly packaged, and endorsed by familiar characters, it was safe. And in the narrow sense of acute harm, it was. No child died from a juice box. But the long-term consequences were not visible in the moment. They accumulated silently over years. By the time the child reached adolescence, the patterns were set. Taste preferences had been shaped. Metabolic pathways had adapted. The body had learned to expect constant sugar, minimal fiber, low nutrient density. Changing those patterns required more than willpower. It required retraining a system that had been built cell by cell on a different fuel. There is a photograph from the 1970s taken at a public school in the Midwest. A classroom of third graders sits at wooden desks. Not one of them appears overweight. Their faces are lean, alert. In the back of the room, a small carton of milk sits on each desk, whole milk, delivered daily. Lunch that day was meatloaf, green beans, and mashed potatoes, made in the school kitchen by cooks who arrived before dawn. A similar photograph from 2015 shows a different scene. The children's bodies are larger, more varied. Several have medical alert bracelets. On the desks are plastic pouches of applesauce, foil-wrapped string cheese, and single-serve boxes of crackers, all pre-packaged, shelf-stable, designed for minimal labor and maximum compliance with updated nutrition guidelines that emphasize low-fat, whole grain, and portion control. Both sets of children were fed according to the best available advice of their time, but the advice had changed, and with it, the child. It would be easy to say this was the result of neglect, or ignorance, or corporate greed. But the truth is more unsettling. Most of the changes were made with good intentions. Fat was removed to prevent heart disease. Sugar was added to make healthy food palatable. Fortification was introduced to prevent deficiencies. Convenience was embraced to help working parents. Every step had a rationale. What was not fully understood was the cumulative effect, that removing fat would lead to adding sugar, that adding sugar would alter the microbiome, that altering the microbiome would affect immune function, that constant snacking would disrupt insulin regulation, that processed foods, even when fortified, could not replicate the synergy of whole foods. The child's body was treated as a machine, input calories, output energy. But it was not a machine. It was an ecosystem, responsive and adaptive, shaped by what it encountered. And for decades, it encountered substances that had never existed in human history at this scale: high fructose corn syrup, hydrogenated oils, synthetic preservatives, artificial dyes. The body adapted, but adaptation is not the same as thriving. By the 2020s, childhood health had become a managed condition. Schools employed nurses to oversee medication schedules. Classrooms kept stock of inhalers, EpiPens, and glucose monitors. Dietary restrictions were so common that birthday parties required forms. Allergen-free, gluten-free, dairy-free products filled entire grocery aisles, marketed as solutions to problems that had barely existed a generation prior. This was accepted as normal because it had become normal. The child who could eat anything, who rarely saw a doctor, who recovered quickly from illness, was now the outlier. And yet the foods that had contributed to this shift were still on the shelves, still marketed as part of a balanced breakfast, still distributed in schools, still recommended in guidelines that prioritized low cost and convenience over long-term vitality. The system had not failed. It had succeeded in exactly what it was designed to do: produce cheap, accessible, palatable food at scale. What it had not been designed to do was nourish. There is a kind of betrayal that doesn't announce itself. It happens slowly, through 1,000 small substitutions, until the original is forgotten. A generation of children grew up on foods that their great-grandparents would not have recognized as food, and their bodies, resilient as they tried to be, bore the cost. This is not the whole story. It is only one thread, one system, one set of decisions, one cascade of consequences. But it is enough to suggest that what we were fed mattered, that it shaped not just childhood, but the adults those children became, that the baseline we now accept as normal is not inevitable, but constructed, and that it is only one chapter of a much larger story.